Chapter 41. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. Meeting Translator. Nyo I.bo Studio Editor. Nyo I.bo Studio. Ling Pingan sat at the counter with his phone in his hand. He was a little hesitant. He wondered to himself, will there be a problem? He was still young. He didn't want to die so soon. Then he looked on the screen at the muscular, fierce-looking character that he'd chosen. Ling Pingan's heart felt as if it was being scratched by a cat. As long as, I'm careful, he was giving himself a pep talk. Finally, the desire and excitement to play the game won out over the risks of playing it. He was prepared to go with whatever happened in this game. He stretched out his hand to make his selection, but his finger slipped and ended up on the multiplayer adventure option instead. Kaka. His phone started to make weird noises. Ling Pingan frowned. It sounded as if his phone was going to explode. He was about to throw it out of the shop. Then everything in front of him went black. A moment later, his consciousness seemed to appear in a different place. An electronic voice resounded next to his ear, "Dear player Monkfahai, this is the official guide for Legend of Nightmare. Please follow my prompts and familiarize yourself with how to control the character and skills involved." In Beizhou Kingdom, in Xianan City, within the Ministry of the Interior, Chu Weiwei walked quickly to the room that she had been given to rest in. She quickly entered and shut the door behind her. The half-closed eye on her wrist was slowly opening up. The stinging pain was reminding her that she had to enter the realm of nightmare as soon as possible. Otherwise, something terrible was going to happen. As she walked through the door, the countdown on her wrist had gone down to 0. Immediately, everything before Chu Weiwei went dark, and she lost consciousness. When she opened her eyes again, she found herself in the middle of a deep fog. She raised her hand, but she couldn't even see her fingers through the fog. And she couldn't hear anything either. The entire world around her had gone silent. She was left with nothing but the sound of her beating heart. Chu Weiwei wanted to check out her surroundings. However, when she reached the edge of the fog, an invisible wall seemed to be blocking her way, and she couldn't move forward anymore. She had no choice but to walk back in the direction from which she had come. After more than 10 minutes had passed, there was finally some change in the fog. Many pairs of evil, demonic-looking bloodshot eyes started to light up in the fog, one after the other. After that, the fog seemed to form glowing rows of text as Chu Weiwei looked on in terror. Welcome. Legend of Nightmare player, Pretty Weiwei. You are about to experience your first nightmare world. For special reasons, the realm has prepared some exciting options for you. You can choose one of the following options. A. Discover what happens in the nightmare world before you play. B. Randomly obtain an identity in the nightmare world. This identity will not be any lower than a commoner. C. Enter a nightmare lucky draw one time for free. Note: each entry to the lucky draw will cost 1,000 nightmare points. D. Receive 1 nightmare secret. Note: after collecting 10 different nightmare secrets, you can get an entrance ticket to the one and only nightmare world. Chu Weiwei looked at the various options and chose A without thinking too much about it. This was because she knew that even though the other 3 looked like good options, they wouldn't be of much help to her. This option A looked ordinary, but it could hold important clues. After she made this choice, the text that had been made out of fog rearranged itself, and a surreal blurry scene appeared before Chu Weiwei's eyes. An evil, terrifying voice started speaking in a low voice. Do animals dream? Many people ask Alucard. Alucard replies, yes, they do. As long as I plant these seeds right into their laughably simplistic little brains. As the voice spoke, Chu Weiwei saw a twisted figure planting a gray spark with an awful stench into the brain of an animal that looked like a bull of sorts. When they grow up, the evil, terrifying voice began to laugh, Alucard will be able to obtain a perfect place for the pestilence to begin. All the fog dissipated, and Chu Weiwei found herself standing in the middle of a dense forest. The forest was thick and its underbrush was stacked layer upon layer. Everything around her was engulfed by darkness, and she could barely see ahead of her. This was even though the sky was dotted with stars and the moon was shining brightly. It was clearly nighttime. Many black ants started climbing out from in between the rocks and the dead leaves. Then they came together to form a glowing row of text. Main mission. Find Alucard. Once she had read the last word, the ants went on their way again. Chu Weiwei could hear the prompt from the realm of nightmare saying to her. Legend of Nightmare player Pretty Weiwei, you have already entered the nightmare world. You must complete this mission before you are allowed to leave. In this nightmare world, besides the main mission, there are many side missions that you can choose from. Please choose them carefully and complete them to your best ability. The language used in this world has been automatically downloaded, and you will forget it once you leave the nightmare world. Your outward appearance and other special characteristics have been covered up by the realm, so they will not attract the attention of the others in the nightmare world. Before Chu Weiwei could fully digest all of this, she could hear voices around her. She turned to look and saw various figures slowly taking shape in the air around her. In general, they were all men. They had differing skin colors. From the looks of it, these were all Legend of Nightmare players from all over the world. But the strangest of them all was one player who stood almost 7 feet tall and was extremely muscular. He was a monk who looked more like some gangster boss. Chu Weiwei looked up and noticed that there was red text that was floating on top of this monk's head. Monk Fahai. Chu Weiwei frowned slightly. A player from the Federal Empire. And you're actually a monk. But this ridiculously muscular monk didn't behave the slightest bit like a monk. The moment he appeared, he burst out laughing very loudly. He looked around at his surroundings and seemed excited enough to dance. This is seriously virtual reality. It's amazing. He leaped off the ground and found himself at the top of a gigantic tree. After that, he disappeared into the darkness at an unbelievable speed. The most irritating part about this whole incident was that, after this fellow had jumped ahead of the rest of them, he'd actually turned back to wave at them as he shouted, "My friends, I'm going ahead first to explore this world. If there's anything you want to talk to me about, you can give me a shout in the Allies communication channel. If I'm free, I might try to join you." Everyone looked after him, then looked at each other. After some time, Chu Weiwei heard a short, stout dark-skinned man from Kunlun State say, "This fellow from the Federal Empire is seriously too bold. He hasn't understood what's happening in the nightmare world yet, and he's just left like that. He's definitely going to die horribly." Everyone else nodded and murmured, "Exactly. The missions within the nightmare world have always been terribly dangerous. Besides, this mission is the first mission since the Realm of Nightmare went through that major change and restarted. The Realm of Nightmare is going to kill that guy for sure." But Chu Weiwei didn't think so. That was because she'd gotten special treatment from the Realm of Nightmare before entering this nightmare world and knew the timeline and part of what was going to happen. After listening to what everyone around her was saying, Chu Weiwei suddenly thought of a possibility. So she didn't hesitate anymore. She leaped up and chased after that monk in the same direction he'd taken as he left. Chapter 42. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Believe in Science Translator. Nyo I.bo Studio Editor. Nyo I.bo Studio Ling Pinyin opened his eyes to find himself in a vast, empty space. He looked down at his hands. His palms were as large as bamboo fans and were covered with thick calluses. These were definitely strong hands that had trained with a hammer that must have weighed a ton. The muscles on his arms were all hard and beefy. Touching them, he felt as if he were touching steel. He heard the guide elf's voice in his ears again. Legend of Nightmare uses the most advanced virtual reality technology available today. It uses the latest advancements in the Federal Empire's research to connect human brain waves to the game itself. Thus, it becomes a game where you can freely move about and control anything. Ling Pinyin felt that there was something wrong about this somewhere. But he couldn't put a finger on it. Besides, whatever he was seeing now was proving that this guide elf's words were right. The Federal Empire had really managed to develop some amazing forms of technology. They had successfully created virtual reality games. But why had he never heard of this before? Maybe they're still testing it. Ling Pinyin thought to himself. Then he didn't think about it anymore. All his thoughts right now were completely attracted to this game that was fantastic beyond his imagination. He tried jumping and found that he could jump almost 20 feet high. What the *LL, Ling Pinyin's jaw dropped at this. This game character of mine seems even greater than a god. The guide elf chose an appropriate time to continue speaking. Dear player, because you are the 1001st player to register for this game, as a reward, for your character in the game, we will change all his attributes to gold attributes. Gold attributes will increase any attribute your character has by 10 times. You can think of any attribute in your mind, and read its explanation. Ling Pinyin felt as if his jaw was going to find it hard to close again after hearing these words. How was there such a thing? This was like something he'd only read about in books becoming a reality. Didn't the developers think about how the game might become terribly unbalanced between the players? But that had nothing to do with him. Which player would give up the chance to have everything good going for him? Why else would those rich gamers be willing to throw up to even million at these games? It was precisely so that they could become invincible in the game and lord it over everyone else. Now, he didn't need to spend a single cent, but he could enjoy the same privileges as those rich gamers, so why should he be bothered at all? So he started thinking about his attributes. The attributes menu then appeared in front of him. Character name. Monkfa height. 6 feet, 8 inches weight. 319 pound strength. 18 vigor. 8 charisma. 2 endurance. 12 There was a question mark behind each value. Ling Pinyin clicked on the question marks curiously, and a text to explain each attribute appeared before him. Strength. Each point of strength will add 1 point of damage. Since your attributes are gold attributes, even without any weapons, you can cause a maximum of 18 times 10 is equal to 180 points of damage. Vigor. Each point of vigor can add 1 point of magic damage when you use a technique. Since your attributes are gold attributes, even without any weapons, you can add a maximum of 8 times 10 is equal to 80 points of damage. Charisma. This affects the way characters pre-existing in the nightmare world and other special characters view you. Each point of charisma can make the other characters like you better by 1 point. Your current points are 2, but because yours are gold attributes, all the characters in the game's impressions and views of you stand at 20 points. Endurance. Each point of endurance is equivalent to 10 hit points. Since you have gold attributes, your total hit points stand at 12 times 10 times 10 is equal to 1,200 points. Besides all this, there were 3 lines of small text that was distorted on the left side of the attributes menu. If you looked very carefully, you could still read the text. Passives. Blindness, invalid in some parts of the nightmare world. Ignores all abnormalities and unable to see any supernatural effects. Passives. Foolishness, blocked in some parts of the nightmare world. Overlooks all abnormalities and uses common sense to understand anything that is out of the ordinary. Passives. Awakening. 0 at hashtag 16940 hashtag, current awakening progress is 2.11%. But Ling Pinyin couldn't see any of these words. He didn't even notice anything on the left of the attributes menu and just looked directly at the skills list on the right. He looked through the 4 skills in the skills menu. Ling Pinyin immediately started frowning. After hesitating, he lit up one of them. Then the guiding elf started to guide him in a brief period of training in this open space. In this way, he became familiar with how to use this skill. After that, he could hardly wait as he followed the guiding elf and stood within a bright circle that was in the middle of the open space. Once he stepped into the bright circle, Ling Pinyin felt everything around him slowly become a blur. After a few moments, his body appeared in a dense forest late at night. He looked around him and saw that other players started appearing like he had. At the same time, a prompt appeared in front of him. Dear player, you are about to enter the latest official copy of Legend of Nightmare. The Dream of Pestilence. Current game mode. Peace. You may encounter some terrifying and bloody scenes in the course of the game. You may say settings to yourself, and choose to close any bloody or terrifying scenes. A gentle reminder from the Legend of Nightmare team. Sometimes, ignorance is bliss. Ling Pinyin scratched his head and burst out laughing. Who are you trying to scare? Do you think I grew up being scared of all these things? Since he had been a little child, Ling Pinyin had never believed in any of these ghosts or demons. They were just superstitions to him. He'd realized this very early on. When he was 11, one of his classmates had told him in a very mysterious tone that the abandoned classrooms at the back of the school were haunted. He'd said that there was a fierce and terrifying ghost that lived there that had already taken the lives of several people. Ling Pinyin had immediately chided this classmate for spreading these superstitious ideas and proceeded to teach his classmate about the philosophy of materialism. There was no such thing as ghosts in the world. In order to prove this, Ling Pinyin had gone into those so-called haunted classrooms that very night. He'd stayed in there for an entire night. Never mind ghosts, he hadn't even seen a rat. After that, Ling Pinyin smugly told all his classmates that they must believe in science. Later on, when he was in college, one of his roommates would always pray and worship some fox spirit really fervently. After Ling Pinyin discovered this, he advised his friend not to fall for such tricks, but that friend was beyond saving and had been completely brainwashed. He even shouted at Ling Pinyin in front of everybody else, "You'll get retribution for blaspheming the fox spirit. The fox spirit is going to make you bleed from every orifice in your body and curse you with a weird illness in 3 days." And after that, Ling Pinyin had continued to live happily and well until this very day. As for that classmate, apparently he transferred schools just a few days later. Perhaps he couldn't stand staying in the school anymore after getting this slap in the face despite declaring such harsh words in front of everyone else. And so Ling Pinyin loved watching horror movies ever since he'd been a boy. The more horrifying the better. And he liked to watch these movies in a crowded theater. When other people in the theater were shuddering in fear, he would just laugh loudly. It was the same now. He laughed loudly, "I don't give a hoot about that. If the scenes you come up with aren't bloody or terrifying enough, I'll lodge a complaint." Before he could finish saying this, Ling Pinyin could feel that his feet had touched the soft ground covered with dead leaves. His heavy body made the dead leaves and dead twigs crackle as they gave way under his weight. The wind felt a little cold as it blew on his face. He froze for a moment. Then he started to jump up and down with great joy. It's serious virtual reality. That's amazing. With that, he abandoned all the teammates that had just appeared. He leaped up and landed on the top of a tree and started moving off at high speed into the distance. If it was possible, he didn't want any teammates at all. As for the game flow of this Legend of Nightmare. Have you ever seen a Grand Theft Auto player actually play according to the official rules of the game? Every player was best at pushing the limits. They were rule-breaking machines. Many people had even caused bugs to appear in the game. Ling Pinyin was no different. A pretentious gamer would get through a game by working together with teammates. A real gamer could make the game developers and operators cry all by himself. On top of that, Ling Pinyin's character had been given an official cheat by the game itself. With this added advantage, he couldn't be bothered to try to conquer the game with a bunch of people he didn't even know. What if there was an elementary school student among them? Chapter 43. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Almighty Dragon of Heaven Translator. Nyo.bo Studio Editor. Nyo.bo Studio. Ling Pinyin continued to move through the trees. In no time at all, he had exited the dense forest. There was a blurry light ahead of him. Ling Pinyin looked at the light. Then he started moving in its direction. According to his understanding, a light meant that there was a person there, and that person was likely to be a non-player character, NPC. Once he found an NPC, then he could get stuff like missions, fight some monsters, or pick up some equipment. And this character of his had been given an official cheat by the game. His endurance levels were incredible and he could feel it too. He could probably cover a few hundred miles in one night without any problems. So he didn't care about consuming his energy and started to move quickly toward the source of the light. A few minutes later, he could see where the light was coming from. It seemed to be a small mountain village. The village was very quiet. It seemed as if all of the residents were fast asleep. There were only a few lights along the road to the village that were flickering slightly. He continued walking toward the village and soon ran into a stone plaque erected along the side of the road. The plaque was engraved with the words, Nanan Village. As soon as he saw the plaque, a prompt appeared in front of his eyes. Dear player, you are very close to the main nightmare area. You may choose from the following options. A. Ask around in the village and become friends with the residents. B. Uphold justice, rebuke those who have chosen evil, and destroy all the demons. After looking at the two options in front of him, Ling Pinyin scratched his head and then, with a serious look on his face, chose option B. He was a law-abiding citizen of the Federal Empire. If he saw an old granny crossing the road, he would go forward to help her along. So of course he was going to be the type of person who would fight anyone who was evil or doing illegal things. Even if it was just in a game. After he'd chosen option B, the village in front of him suddenly became distorted. Fresh blood started to flow out of the ground. An eerie wind blew hard at him, and the air was filled with the sound of crying and howling. Distorted figures started to climb out of the houses in the village. Ling Pinyin looked at them and couldn't help but compliment the game developers, they're so realistic. But, he leaped high up into the sky. All you bold demons. I can tell immediately that none of you is human. Almighty Dragon of Heaven. He used his bamboo fan-sized palms to grab hold of a monster climbing out of the ground. This monster had a head that looked like a toad's, but its body was dry and crackly, like a completely dried-out corpse. Ling Pinyin looked more carefully and saw that there was a name on top of this monster. Alucard's Slave LV3. That looks pretty scary, Ling Pinyin remarked. But it's too bad that you ran into me. He exerted some strength with his large hands and crushed the monster immediately. The monster's body slowly began to turn into stone in his hands. A wind blew past, turning the stone into fine sand. Then, the sand flowed out from his hands. But Ling Pinyin still found the time to take a look at his own battle records. He found information regarding the monster he'd just killed. Alucard's Slave LV3 just attempted to attack your vigor, but because your vigor score is gold attribute 8, you managed to block this attack. You made a physical attack on Alucard's Slave LV3. As your strength is at gold attribute 18, you were able to crush the opponent. You have used the technique Almighty Dragon of Heaven LV1. This attack is considered a weak attack. You have caused Alucard's Slave LV3 180 times 2 times 2 is equal to 720 points of damage. Alucard's Slave's hit points are 120 points. Total damage was 600 points in excess. Alucard's Slave LV3 has been completely destroyed. You have been awarded 30 nightmare points, base reward of 10 points, plus complete destruction reward of 20 points. Ling Pinyin whistled when he read his battle history. I'm really amazing. After that, he laughed cheekily as he looked at the other monsters. Hello, my points, don't run away," he yelled loudly and laughed as he dashed over. He had learned from the guide elf that this Legend of Nightmare used a different leveling up system from traditional online games. It didn't use experience points. Players needed nightmare points to purchase ability points to strengthen one's body. As for his character, since all his attributes had been changed to gold attributes, he had to purchase gold ability points in order to strengthen his character. One gold ability point needed 10,000 nightmare points. As for upgrading and learning skills, he would need to purchase a gold skill scroll, and this thing cost 20,000 nightmare points. So he had to make full use of his time and quickly kill off all the monsters here, then hurry on to the next place to kill more monsters. If he took too long and other players caught up, then they'd end up competing with him to kill monsters. He took some time to also take a look at the description of the skill that he had lighted up as well. Almighty Dragon of Heaven LV1. The enlightened monk uses his unsurpassable mercy to save the world and rid the world of demons. You can immediately use Dharma to mark targets and declare them as demonic. This will last for 3 minutes. All attacks on marked targets will be considered weak attacks. You can mark 3/6/9/12 targets at the same time. Before a marked demon dies, you cannot mark a new demon. After looking at the explanation in the skills menu, Ling Pingyan realized that he had to use his skills a little more sparingly. It was best to leave the marking to those higher level monsters. Using it on a tiny monster of only LV3 had been such a waste. And so, he quickly dashed over and found 2 other monsters that had been marked from among the group of monsters, then slapped them all to death. Chu Weiwei was panting as she followed the tracks left behind by that monk. She had followed him all the way out of the dense forest. There was a creepy-looking small mountain village in front of her now. Before she had even moved closer to the village, Chu Weiwei could already feel goosebumps all over her body. The bells she wore around her wrist started to ring. These bells were from her mother. Before Chu Weiwei was born, her mother got them from Celestial Master Zhang on Dragon Tiger Mountain. Each bell had been blessed by the Celestial Master. They were able to warn, break up evil, and avoid calamity. But now, all of them were ringing non-stop. Chu Weiwei knew very well what that meant. There was a problem with this village. And it was a very big problem. In fact, this could be a very terrifying demon lair. Don't tell me that Monk Fahai just recklessly barged into such a terrifying lair. Chu Weiwei swallowed her saliva. This sort of demon lair needs at least a highly skilled blackguard who is at colonel rank or above to even enter. If he accidentally goes in like that, he might not come out alive. Just then, Chu Weiwei heard an angry shout that sounded like a clap of thunder. All you bold demons! I can tell immediately that none of you is human. Almighty Dragon of Heaven! Chu Weiwei looked in the direction of the voice and saw the bulky figure of the monk. He had jumped up from one of the buildings in the village into the air. Then he laughed weirdly before dashing into the village. Chu Weiwei swallowed hard. She carefully got closer. The next thing she saw absolutely dumbfounded her. There were monsters. A huge group of them. They were in all shapes and sizes. Chu Weiwei's heart trembled when she saw these terrifying-looking monsters. But they were acting like a bunch of sheep in front of the muscular monk. Every time the monk dashed into the crowd of monsters, he could beat or slap several monsters to smithereens. And some of these monsters were so terrifying that Chu Weiwei nearly fainted from fright. This is incredible. Chu Weiwei felt that her views on life and her complete worldview were being reshaped right now. There were at least a few dozen monsters there. There were some that were even at the colonel level. All of them combined were enough to make things difficult for a blackguard colonel. But now, they were acting more like a school of fish that had just run into a whale. They could only tremble and huddle together as this powerful enemy forced them into a corner. If they fought back, they would definitely die. If they wanted to escape, there was nowhere to run. Chapter 44. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Lucky One Translator. Nyo iwo Studio Editor. Nyo iwo Studio, all you bold demons. I can tell that none of you are human. Almighty Dragon of Heaven. The muscular monk was roaring like an angry gorilla. He was acting like a tiger marauding among the sheep. He'd slapped a few dozen monsters to death right in front of Chu Weiwei. During the entire process, he'd been touched by almost no counterattacks. The monsters had tried to attack and defend themselves, but nothing they did seemed to even damage a single hair on the monk's head. Chu Weiwei stood watching this spectacle in a daze. After a very short while, all the monsters had just been turned into a pile of fine sand. The wind blew up, and soon the entire village disappeared completely as if it had been nothing but a sandcastle. Only the lamps along the road were still there, flickering away. Chu Weiwei swallowed hard. She felt such awe that she couldn't help but take a step back. Her foot caught in a root from a tree that was behind her, and she tripped, falling into the trunk of the tree. Then there was an extremely loud cracking sound as the large tree split into pieces like a pile of Legos that had been put together by a child. Soon after that, the entire forest where Chu Weiwei was standing started to make these cracking sounds as it fell apart. In just the blink of an eye, the forest, the village, and even the lamps along the street had disappeared completely as though they'd been fog blown away by the wind. The true nature of this place was slowly revealed as well. This was no village on the mountain at all. This had clearly been a bloody open-air slaughterhouse. There were several sharp metal hooks still attached to fallen walls and broken bones lying around that were void of blood or flesh. In fact, broken bones could be seen lying in piles all over the ground. Rotting organs had been dumped in drains that were devoid of water. There was a rather old-looking stone plaque in front of the slaughterhouse. Chu Weiwei was curious. She went up to the plaque and wiped away the moss that covered it. Then she saw the words that had been engraved on the plaque. Her eyes widened instantly. Nanan Village, she exclaimed. This is Nanan Village. It was true that the words Nanan Village were engraved onto that stone plaque. There was even an additional note on the bottom left-hand corner of the plaque. Shisong Kingdom, Guangling County, Republic Year 2740. This stone plaque was from almost 100 years ago. After looking at this, Chu Weiwei was no longer doubtful. This place was really Nanan Village. A Shisong village that had mysteriously vanished. Countless people had tried to search for this place for the past 100 years, but to no avail. From the looks of it now. Chu Weiwei lifted her head to look at the sky in this nightmare world. It was a beautiful dark sky where the moon shone brightly and the stars sparkled like jewels. But for some strange reason, she felt very cold all over. That was because the appearance of Nanan Village meant that this realm of nightmare was even more mysterious than she had imagined. Also, this place showed that the game mixed fantasy with reality. Or, at least, that Alucard definitely had had something to do with the disappearance of Nanan Village, which had now appeared within this nightmare world. This is Nanan Village. Without her realizing it, the tall, muscular monk had appeared next to Chu Weiwei. Chu Weiwei lifted up her head to look at him. She was considered to be quite tall. But even though she stood at 5'7", she looked like a child compared to this monk. It took her quite a lot of effort just to be able to see his face. Strangely enough, also, even though this monk looked vicious and fierce, he seemed to be pretty friendly. He'd even sent Chu Weiwei a nightmare invitation. Legend of Nightmare player Monk Fahai invites you to join his team. When Chu Weiwei saw the prompt with the mark of a nightmare, she clicked on OK. After that, the next prompt came. You have joined a nightmare team. The team leader is Monk Fahai. Team leader has changed the collection mode to pick freely. Team leader will reallocate. After that, the monk said, why are you still in a daze? Hurry up and help me to sweep this place up. His bamboo fan-sized hands pointed at the mess of broken bones that were lying around them in all directions. Chu Weiwei suddenly realized that there were several black and silver boxes lying among the bones. They resembled the boxes in a game that she used to play. "Senior," she asked in a soft voice, "are you talking to me?" Ling Pingyan looked at this female player who was standing in front of him with a quizzical look. "Senior. Is this some sort of culture unique to Legend of Nightmare?" He wondered to himself. Every group had its own set of jargon. Ling Pingyan understood this and respected it too. After all, he also used a lot of inside words in other games. So with that in mind, he nodded. "Take it as that then." When the female player, Pretty Weiwei, heard these words, she immediately clasped her hands together and used a very old way of responding politely, "Your junior accepts these instructions. This monk will have to thank the dear donor for her services then." Ling Pingyan got into the role and used a very monk-like response as well. When it came to making witty jokes, nobody could beat an online novel writer. After all, if an online novelist couldn't keep up with the times or understand the latest trends, he'd get thrown out. Chu Weiwei immediately got to work. This was an instruction from her senior. So she didn't delay for a single moment and immediately immersed herself in the work of opening these boxes. She walked over and squatted down to open one of the boxes on the ground. The box opened with a cracking sound. It revealed what it contained. It was a ginseng that was bright red in color. It was as long as both of her hands together. The ginseng gave off a mesmerizing scent as soon as she took it out of the box. Chu Weiwei curiously checked to see if there was any information on this item and a prompt from the realm of nightmare popped up. "You have opened a nightmare silver grade loot box. You have obtained 100 bold ghost ginseng. 100 bold ghost ginseng. Place of origin: any nightmare world with ghosts and spirits. Quality: high silver, grade. Weight: 3.5 ounces. You may consume it as it is or you can use it to make medicine. Consumption: instantly regain 100 hit points and 100 mana points. After that, you will regain 10 hit points and mana points every second for 15 seconds and gain 1 point of strength or 1 point of vigor, limited to only the first consumption. You may also sell it to the realm of nightmare and gain 1000 nightmare points." Chu Weiwei started swallowing as she looked at the description of this ghost ginseng. That was because her total hit points were only at 110 points. In other words, this ghost ginseng could save her life. More important, she had asked the Mark of Nightmare about whether she could take anything from the nightmare world out of the world when she left. She had received an affirmative response. As long as you have enough points to exchange, you can take any loot from the nightmare world back to the real world. If she wanted to take this ghost ginseng back to the real world, she would need to pay 1,500 nightmare points. Before entering this nightmare world, the realm of nightmare had given her a warning. The realm has digitized your body, so any damage to your brain or heart in the course of your adventures within the nightmare world will not immediately cause you to die and will only subtract from your hit points. Once your hit points total is 0, however, you will die. In other words, if she could take this ghost ginseng back to the real world, this would instantly become a magical medicine that could revive the dead. The rich folks of the Federal Empire would definitely give her everything they had in exchange for this. While Chu Weiwei was still in a daze, she heard the monk exclaim in surprise behind her, "You lucky one. You're seriously too lucky. I've opened at least 7 or 8 boxes, and it was all trash. All of it together would only sell for about 1,000 points. But this one box of yours is equivalent to all my boxes. Hurry up and keep working." The monk urged her on. Chapter 45. Acre Castle Translator. Nyo.bo Studio Editor. Nyo.bo Studio, alright, senior. Chu Weiwei suppressed the excitement in her heart and got to work again. She started to check the other boxes that were lying around on the ground. When she opened them, she found equipment, medicine, and various other items. She even found a recipe for a potion. Cross-dressing potion. Quality: silver high. Grade: origin: any nightmare world with a king/knight in it. Formula: 30 grams of disguising lotion, 7 grams of all-purpose water. Let it ferment for 10 days in a nightmare fermenter. Application: apply on the skin. Explanation: if I lifted a rabbit by its ears, the male would twitch its front legs, while a female would keep its eyes closed most of the time. But if I let them run side by side, who would know which is male and which is female? Give up the fight. Human, I know that you've wanted this for a long time. Wear that pink dress and put on that purple hair clip. Get your lipstick and nail polish on. Believe me, the entire world will be mesmerized by you. You can sell this to the realm of nightmare and get 1,500 nightmare points. When Chu Weiwei saw this potion recipe, she was stunned for a few moments. Then she received a prompt from the Mark of Nightmare. Team leader Monkfahai has given you the cross-dressing potion recipe. You have received the recipe for cross-dressing potion. Chu Weiwei looked up in surprise. Then she spotted her senior giving her a look filled with encouragement. This made her face blush a little bit, so she quickly changed the subject and asked, "Senior, what do I do with the equipment and other items that I've picked up?" "Anything that's less than silver. Grade can be sold off," said the monk without thinking too much about it. Chu Weiwei was stunned for a moment after hearing this, but then she nodded. She followed her senior's instructions and sold off all the equipment and miscellaneous items that were less than silver. Grade. After that, she received a few prompts from the realm of nightmare. You have sold a black iron low. Grade piece of equipment. Slaves riding boots worth 50 nightmare points. But because you are not the owner of this item, you will only get 5 nightmare points as a tip. You have sold a black iron high. Grade piece of equipment. Slave's long sword, worth 150 nightmare points. But because you are not the owner of this item, you will only get 14 nightmare points as a tip. After a lot of prompts, Chu Weiwei realized that all the equipment and miscellaneous items that she had sold thanks to her senior had added up to nearly 600 points in just tips. This was really. She sold off all the equipment and miscellaneous items that were below silver. Grade. Chu Weiwei's Mark of Nightmare then was only left with a few pieces of silver. Grade equipment and magical items. After her senior had checked through the descriptions of all these things, he allowed her to take 2 of the pieces of equipment for herself. Chu Weiwei felt terribly honored. She didn't know how to thank him. She could only clasp her hands and bow. "Thank you, senior, for your great kindness. I will repay you in the days to come." Ling Pingyan looked at this female player who was so obsessed with the game and scratched his head. He was thinking, it's only 2 pieces of equipment, and you can't exchange them for money either. This girl is a little too over the top. To Ling Pingyan, it was true that this Legend of Nightmare had been really well designed and developed, and it used the latest technology of the Federal Empire. But, at the end of the day, it was just a game. So none of these things were worth any money to him now. Of course, these things might be worth money in the future. But that was a discussion for a later time. So he didn't think very much about it now. But, in order to show off, he cleared his throat and replied, "It's just 2 material items. You're too obsessed with these superficial things. Also, we have crossed each other's paths because of fate. Perhaps these 2 items were fated to be yours because of something that happened in a different lifetime." Ling Pingyan then pretended to be high and mighty as he shouted a Buddhist chant, Amitabha. The female player put her palms together and very reverently bowed to him. "Senior, you are of high morals and upright. Your junior will learn from you." This fed Ling Pingyan's ego quite a bit. When it came to playing games, feeling good was the most important thing. So he started walking forward once again. Good donor. There are many more demons in this place that are waiting for me to send them into the netherworld. That's right. He had to quickly find the next place with demons so that he could earn more nightmare points by killing them. He needed about another 10,000 points to be able to purchase that gold skill scroll and obtain a new skill. To be honest, when Ling Pingyuan had first discovered the presence of this female player, he didn't want to be bothered by her at all. But later, he realized he had a problem. If he just went around killing and harvesting everything in the game with no impunity and had no audience to watch him do it, then it was missing that feel-good factor. It was just like how the main character in a novel always needed a few sidekicks to look more impressive. And, in reality, even a comedic duo had one member to play a supporting role. For these reasons, he decided to invite this female player to join his team. First, he wanted someone to witness his amazing abilities and incomparable skills in the game. Second, it was really too troublesome to pick up all the trash on the ground all the time. He needed an assistant of sorts too. Ling Pingyuan brought the female player called Pretty Weiwei along as he traveled on. He followed a deserted, quiet asphalt road that headed eastward. After a while, he saw a light in the distance again. When he listened carefully, he could hear the faint sound of waves breaking. This made Ling Pingyuan immediately become excited. Of course, he didn't forget to follow the manner of speech he'd had to adopt in this Legend of Nightmare. Amitba. He looked at the light source in the distance. The evil aura of that place is terrible, which meant that there were many points to be collected there, so I will be like an angry gorilla and become like a Vidyaraja, a wisdom king, banishing these things and attaining nirvana as soon as possible. He hastened his steps and started moving ahead quickly. But that was really tough on Chu Weiwei behind him. In just a few minutes, she was panting and perspiring profusely. Thankfully, the source of the light wasn't too far away. In just a few moments, Ling Pingyuan was able to see what the whole place looked like. It was an ancient castle that had been built on a cliff facing the sea. Looking at its architecture, it had clearly been built in the style of bastions from 200 years ago. The light from several candles shone brightly from the windows of the castle. There seemed to be some figures walking around inside. He could also hear some melodious, cheery music being played from inside. In front of Ling Pingyuan, another plaque appeared. He walked nearer to take a look at it, only to find that it had been written in a language that belonged to some country outside the Federal Empire. He scratched his head because he couldn't understand these words at all. But when Chu Weiwei finally caught up with him and spotted the stone plaque, she exclaimed in shock, "Senior, this is Acre Castle." Acre Castle. Ling Pingyuan was a little stunned. You mean Acre Castle from 200 years ago? This caught him by surprise. Most citizens of the Federal Empire didn't really bother themselves too much about anything that happened outside of the Federal Empire. Especially those who had been born after the Federal Empire was formed. Many of them didn't even know how many countries there were in the world. They had no idea about what sort of place all these messy non-Federation countries were. But there were always exceptions. This Acre Castle was one of them. That was because a bloody battle had happened here in the past. The battle had happened toward the end of the Federal Empire's war to free the southern Shang dynasty. The two parties fighting this battle had both been enemies of the Federal Empire at that time. The party fighting against the Acre Castle was termed by the history textbooks in the Federation as the Prince of Qin, who was also known as the Pioneer of Freedom. He was the commander of the Kingdom of France and later became the head of the Holy Roman Empire. Of course, he had a place in the Federal Empire's history textbooks. But it was only a 20 or 30-word paragraph. This battle at Acre Castle changed the course of the land of Qin's history. The one who'd lost the war was forced to retreat. After they returned to their country, there was a great political change, and the old, corrupt government was overturned. The victors of Acre Castle wanted to annihilate their enemies, so they created a sacred alliance. There were also many legends that had grown up about that particular battle. For example, Ling Pingyuan had had a classmate in college who had gone to study in the Kingdom of France. Whenever he talked about this bloody battle, he always got very worked up, saying things like, the English were despicable and actually planted an undead army within the castle, and, if they hadn't done that, how could the brave and fearless infantry of the king have suffered such a defeat? Ling Pingyan just replied very simply, "That's right, the great kingdom of France would never surrender unless Paris fell first." The classmate didn't know what to say after that. The stories that his classmate recounted were some of the most widely known legends. According to these legends, the opponent had been an army of evil spirits led by a terrifying demonic general. This was how they'd managed to defend the castle for 1 year with very little support, causing the god of war of Qin to abandon the battle and finally lose miserably. From the look of it, the game developers had probably designed this place with that legend in mind. Ling Pingyan thought about this as he walked farther ahead to touch that stone plaque. Just like the last time, a prompt appeared in front of him. "Dear player, you have reached the core of the nightmare. Acre Castle. You can choose. A. Apparently, Princess Moradon lives in Acre Castle. She has plump, juicy legs as well as a bright, mesmerizing mouth. You can invite her to attend a grand banquet held for the sake of reproducing life. B. You are unaffected by anything worldly. Mercifulness is your virtue, and exterminating demons is your mission." Ling Pingyan didn't need to think about this choice for more than a minute and chose B immediately. The moment he made his choice, all the candles in the castle were extinguished instantly. Chapter 45. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Acre Castle B. Noel.m Translator. Nyo I.bo Studio Editor. Nyo I.bo Studio. Alright, Senior. Chu Weiwei suppressed the excitement in her heart and got to work again. She started to check the other boxes that were lying around on the ground. When she opened them, she found equipment, medicine, and various other items. She even found a recipe for a potion. Cross-dressing potion. Quality: silver high. Grade: origin: any nightmare world with a king/knight in it. Formula: 30 grams of disguising lotion, 7 grams of all-purpose water. Let it ferment for 10 days in a nightmare fermenter. Application: apply on the skin. Explanation: if I lifted a rabbit by its ears, the male would twitch its front legs, while a female would keep its eyes closed most of the time. But if I let them run side by side, who would know which is male and which is female? Give up the fight. Human, I know that you've wanted this for a long time. Wear that pink dress and put on that purple hair clip. Get your lipstick and nail polish on. Believe me, the entire world will be mesmerized by you. You can sell this to the realm of nightmare and get 1,500 nightmare points. When Chu Weiwei saw this potion recipe, she was stunned for a few moments. Then she received a prompt from the Mark of Nightmare. Team leader Monkfahai has given you the cross-dressing potion recipe. You have received the recipe for cross-dressing potion. Chu Weiwei looked up in surprise. Then she spotted her senior giving her a look filled with encouragement. This made her face blush a little bit, so she quickly changed the subject and asked, "Senior, what do I do with the equipment and other items that I've picked up?" "Anything that's less than silver. Grade can be sold off," said the monk without thinking too much about it. Chu Weiwei was stunned for a moment after hearing this, but then she nodded. She followed her senior's instructions and sold off all the equipment and miscellaneous items that were less than silver grade. After that, she received a few prompts from the realm of nightmare. You have sold a black iron low. Grade piece of equipment. Slaves riding boots worth 50 nightmare points. But because you are not the owner of this item, you will only get 5 nightmare points as a tip. You have sold a black iron high. Grade piece of equipment. Slave's long sword, worth 150 nightmare points. But because you are not the owner of this item, you will only get 14 nightmare points as a tip. After a lot of prompts, Chu Weiwei realized that all the equipment and miscellaneous items that she had sold thanks to her senior had added up to nearly 600 points in just tips. This was really... She sold off all the equipment and miscellaneous items that were below silver grade. Chu Weiwei's Mark of Nightmare then was only left with a few pieces of silver grade equipment and magical items. After her senior had checked through the descriptions of all these things, he allowed her to take 2 of the pieces of equipment for herself. Chu Weiwei felt terribly honored. She didn't know how to thank him. She could only clasp her hands and bow. Thank you, senior, for your great kindness. I will repay you in the days to come. Ling Pingyan looked at this female player who was so obsessed with the game and scratched his head. He was thinking, it's only 2 pieces of equipment, and you can't exchange them for money either. This girl is a little too over the top. To Ling Pingyan, it was true that this Legend of Nightmare had been really well designed and developed, and it used the latest technology of the Federal Empire. But, at the end of the day, it was just a game. So none of these things were worth any money to him now. Of course, these things might be worth money in the future. But that was a discussion for a later time. So he didn't think very much about it now. But, in order to show off, he cleared his throat and replied, it's just 2 material items. You're too obsessed with these superficial things. Also, we have crossed each other's paths because of fate. Perhaps these 2 items were fated to be yours because of something that happened in a different lifetime. Ling Pingyan then pretended to be high and mighty as he shouted a Buddhist chant, Amitabha. The female player put her palms together and very reverently bowed to him. Senior, you are of high morals and upright. Your junior will learn from you. This fed Ling Pingyan's ego quite a bit. When it came to playing games, feeling good was the most important thing. So he started walking forward once again. Good donor. There are many more demons in this place that are waiting for me to send them into the netherworld. That's right. He had to quickly find the next place with demons so that he could earn more nightmare points by killing them. He needed about another 10,000 points to be able to purchase that gold skill scroll and obtain a new skill. To be honest, when Ling Pingyan had first discovered the presence of this female player, he didn't want to be bothered by her at all. But later, he realized he had a problem. If he just went around killing and harvesting everything in the game with no impunity and had no audience to watch him do it, then it was missing that feel-good factor. It was just like how the main character in a novel always needed a few sidekicks to look more impressive. And, in reality, even a comedic duo had one member to play a supporting role. For these reasons, he decided to invite this female player to join his team. First, he wanted someone to witness his amazing abilities and incomparable skills in the game. Second, it was really too troublesome to pick up all the trash on the ground all the time. He needed an assistant of sorts too. Ling Pingyan brought the female player called Pretty Weiwei along as he traveled on. He followed a deserted, quiet asphalt road that headed eastward. After a while, he saw a light in the distance again. When he listened carefully, he could hear the faint sound of waves breaking. This made Ling Pingyan immediately become excited. Of course, he didn't forget to follow the manner of speech he'd had to adopt in this Legend of Nightmare. Amitabha. He looked at the light source in the distance. The evil aura of that place is terrible, which meant that there were many points to be collected there, so I will be like an angry gorilla and become like a Vidyaraja, a wisdom king, banishing these things and attaining nirvana as soon as possible. He hastened his steps and started moving ahead quickly. But that was really tough on Chu Weiwei behind him. In just a few minutes, she was panting and perspiring profusely. Thankfully, the source of the light wasn't too far away. In just a few moments, Ling Pingyan was able to see what the whole place looked like. It was an ancient castle that had been built on a cliff facing the sea. Looking at its architecture, it had clearly been built in the style of bastions from 200 years ago. The light from several candles shone brightly from the windows of the castle. There seemed to be some figures walking around inside. He could also hear some melodious, cheery music being played from inside. In front of Ling Pingyan, another plaque appeared. He walked nearer to take a look at it, only to find that it had been written in a language that belonged to some country outside the Federal Empire. He scratched his head because he couldn't understand these words at all. But when Chu Weiwei finally caught up with him and spotted the stone plaque, she exclaimed in shock, "Senior, this is Acre Castle." Acre Castle. Ling Pinyin was a little stunned. "You mean Acre Castle from 200 years ago?" This caught him by surprise. Most citizens of the Federal Empire didn't really bother themselves too much about anything that happened outside of the Federal Empire. Especially those who had been born after the Federal Empire was formed. Many of them didn't even know how many countries there were in the world. They had no idea about what sort of place all these messy non-Federation countries were. But there were always exceptions. This Acre Castle was one of them. That was because a bloody battle had happened here in the past. The battle had happened toward the end of the Federal Empire's war to free the southern Shang dynasty. The two parties fighting this battle had both been enemies of the Federal Empire at that time. The party fighting against the Acre Castle was termed by the history textbooks in the Federation as the Prince of Qin, who was also known as the Pioneer of Freedom. He was the commander of the Kingdom of France and later became the head of the Holy Roman Empire. Of course, he had a place in the Federal Empire's history textbooks. But it was only a 20 or 30-word paragraph. This battle at Acre Castle changed the course of the land of Qin's history. The one who'd lost the war was forced to retreat. After they returned to their country, there was a great political change, and the old, corrupt government was overturned. The victors of Acre Castle wanted to annihilate their enemies, so they created a sacred alliance. There were also many legends that had grown up about that particular battle. For example, Ling Pinyin had had a classmate in college who had gone to study in the Kingdom of France. Whenever he talked about this bloody battle, he always got very worked up, saying things like, the English were despicable and actually planted an undead army within the castle, and, if they hadn't done that, how could the brave and fearless infantry of the king have suffered such a defeat? Ling Pinyin just replied very simply, "That's right, the great Kingdom of France would never surrender unless Paris fell first." The classmate didn't know what to say after that. The stories that his classmate recounted were some of the most widely known legends. According to these legends, the opponent had been an army of evil spirits led by a terrifying demonic general. This was how they'd managed to defend the castle for 1 year with very little support, causing the god of war of Qin to abandon the battle and finally lose miserably. From the look of it, the game developers had probably designed this place with that legend in mind. Ling Pinyin thought about this as he walked farther ahead to touch that stone plaque. Just like the last time, a prompt appeared in front of him. "Dear player, you have reached the core of the nightmare. Acre Castle. You can choose. A. Apparently, Princess Moradon lives in Acre Castle. She has plump, juicy legs as well as a bright, mesmerizing mouth. You can invite her to attend a grand banquet held for the sake of reproducing life. B. You are unaffected by anything worldly. Mercifulness is your virtue, and exterminating demons is your mission." Ling Pinyin didn't need to think about this choice for more than a minute and chose B immediately. The moment he made his choice, all the candles in the castle were extinguished instantly. Chapter 46. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Easily destroyed translator. Nyo.bo Studio Editor. Nyo.bo Studio. After all the candles in the castle on the cliff's edge had been extinguished, this vast deserted land slowly filled up with an evil wind. Creak, crack. Skeleton after skeleton started to climb out from beneath the surface of the ground. They got to their feet a little unsteadily, and a ghostly fire began to burn within their eyes. There were even some tall skeleton generals riding on skeleton horses waving glowing long swords in their hands. Ling Pinyin looked at everything that was appearing before him, and he almost whistled. But then he realized that he had an audience now, so he made a serious show of putting his palms together and giving a Buddhist chant, Amitabha. Wonderful, just wonderful. After that, he started to walk with a face filled with compassion like one of those old monks. Senior. His audience member's concerned voice called out after him. Those are the spirits of the infantry of the Kingdom of France. You have to be very careful. The infantry of the Kingdom of France had been almost impossible to defeat according to the history books. Even the army of the Federal Empire had had much respect for them. Among the infantry, there was a special team named the King's Guard. They were the king's sharpest soldiers and were well known as an extraordinary team throughout the land of Qin. Legend had it that every member of the King's Guard had been trained in the famous Church of Bones in the land of Qin. Every single one of them had been extremely well trained, and every one of them was devoted to their group. Chu Weiwei had recognized them the moment the skeletons had climbed out of the ground. They were wearing purple and gold army uniforms, and Chu Weiwei could still make out the bauhinia flowers that had been embroidered on the shoulders of their uniforms. So she was very sure that these skeletons used to be the best and the most loyal King's Guard of the king. They had already been very terrifying when they were alive. Every single member was at least as capable as a second lieutenant in the Blackguard. Now they were all dead. So they had only become even stronger. Just as she had expected, after the skeletons had spotted the senior walking toward them, they had looked up and started roaring. Every skeleton looked as if they were on fire. A green ghostly fire started to burn from within their dry bones. Their creepy, malicious, terrifying voices were coming out of their long rotten voice boxes. Forward! Servants of the Master! Rise up! A glorious day awaits you. Look, the Master is watching us. Raise your flag that is covered with flesh and blood. Raise your flag that is covered with flesh and blood. Do you hear that? Servants of the Master! A glorious battle is calling out to us. They stomped their feet and roared as they got into a neat formation, just as if they were still a well-disciplined set of troops. Some raised their long swords, and a ghostly fire danced on the blades. Some raised firearms that had been damaged and rotted long ago. Their souls were gunpowder and their pain was bullets. There were even some skeleton soldiers who dug out a broken, rusty cannon from the ground. They pushed this cannon all the way to the front. One of the skeletons pulled his own head off and stuffed it into the body of the cannon. Boom! That cannon actually still worked. Chu Weiwei's body started to tremble as she watched this. It's the undead army. It's the undead army. Records from the Blackguards immediately came into her mind. For the last 200 years, the army and the Blackguards of the Federal Empire had met these terrifying evil enemies many times. Every time they did, they'd had to pay a terrible price. It was only in the last 50 years that the Federal Empire had grasped the secret of the sun and found a way to make high-capacity hydrogen bombs. Those were able to completely exterminate and destroy these undead things. Because of the hydrogen bombs, the commander-in-chief of the Federal Empire had risen up and was able to hold his control over the entire world. So these things had slowly begun to disappear. But in this place, in this nightmare world, Chu Weiwei knew that the hydrogen bombs of the Federal Empire were a long way off. And the commander-in-chief couldn't possibly get here. Senior. She couldn't help but shout out to him, "You can't kill the undead with brute force alone." That was common knowledge. All the members of the Blackguard knew about this from the first day they enlisted. The undead were basically monsters that had been tortured and distorted from an evil spell that had been cast on them. These things did not fear death, had no emotions, and never felt tired. It wasn't so scary if they were by themselves. It was scary when they were in a group like this. They could form teams, work together, and protect each other. They could even get into formations and work together to launch various attacks. That meant that they still had their intelligence from the time when they were alive. Only the most powerful wizards of death could create undead spirits like this. In other words, there was still a terrifying and powerful wizard of death behind all these things. In general, a wizard of death that could conjure up a troop of undead spirits had to be a monster of at least the major, general level. As far as Chu Weiwei knew, only the commander-in-chief could fight such an enemy by himself. But after hearing her cries, the muscular monk just turned back and smiled. His large, burly face actually broke into a kindly smile. Then she heard him say, "Dear donor, do not worry. Just look forward to how I banish all these things." With that, he leapt up into the air. He started making his way toward the skeleton cannonball that had been fired from the cannon. "All you bold demons. I can tell at one glance that none of you are human. Almighty dragon of heaven." He used one hand to catch hold of the cannonball that had been shot out of the cannon at high speed, and he exerted some force. Chu Weiwei watched as that skeleton head with its ghostly fire became ash in this senior's large hand. And he didn't stop there. He continued to rush onward toward the undead troops coming toward him. Chu Weiwei ended up witnessing a massacre. And it was a massacre where everything was destroyed so easily. The muscular monk was like a tank that went straight for the formation of undead soldiers. Those frightening spirits raised their guns to shoot at the monk. The bullets carrying ghostly fire hit him, but didn't even manage to graze his skin. And, every time the monk made an attack, he would be able to slam a skeleton to pieces. "All you bold demons. I can tell at one glance that none of you are human. Almighty dragon of heaven." As he continued to roar loudly, the original army of around 200 undead soldiers were slowly slammed into powder and crushed to the ground, one after another. Chu Weiwei just watched. She almost forgot to breathe or think. The only thing she thought about was, since when did the Federal Empire have such a highly skilled monk with such high morals? One had to know that the Buddhists were supposed to be similar to the Taoists. The Buddhists also had to meditate, remain pure, keep themselves disciplined, and work hard at keeping themselves this way. But the Buddhist world of the Federation today. Chu Weiwei had seen some of their luxury cars and nightclubs. She had also run into those who kept 2, 3, or even 4 mistresses. She had never seen a monk who was morally upright and abided strictly to the principles of Buddhism. But that was hard. The amount of money a temple received every year from the offerings of the believers for incense was enough to make one's head shake. When a monk just stood before a statue of Buddha, they could receive tens of thousands of dollars for their services. Who would still bother about sticking by the principles of Buddhism? Who would still care about chanting and meditation? But if they didn't keep their principles or meditate on scriptures, then, even if they were a reincarnation of Bodhisattva or Buddha in human form, they would reincarnate into just a normal living thing in the future. This man must be a highly upright one who never comes out and just hides himself in a temple in the deep mountains. Chu Weiwei thought to herself. But this monk is a little too violent, isn't he? She looked at the battle before her. To put it more accurately, this was a massacre. Just moments ago, there had been a large and imposing troop of undead soldiers here. Now they were all in tatters and could barely stand. Finally, the one behind all these undead spirits couldn't sit still anymore. Creak, crack, creak, crack. A number of creepy sounds rang out from below the ground. And then, boom! A large monster came out from beneath the surface of the earth. It had 9 large and fierce-looking snake heads. Its entire body was covered in green scales. Its gigantic body was as large as a small mountain. Hydra! Chu Weiwei exclaimed in shock. This was Hydra, the 9-headed monster from those legends from the land of Qin. But this monster was also dead. There were already signs of rot on this large, terrifying monster's body. Maggots were all over its snake heads. This was clearly a Hydra that had been killed and then cruelly transformed into an undead spirit. Chapter 47. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Salvation through repentance. Nav Om Translator. Nyo I.bo Studio Editor. Nyo I.bo Studio. These details are truly exquisite. Ling Pinyin raised his head and looked at the monster that had just come out of the ground. He couldn't help but express his admiration for this game's developers. If every game developer in the Federal Empire were this good, they wouldn't need to worry about taking money out of my pocket anymore, he exclaimed. Unfortunately, The Legend of Nightmare didn't seem to have an in-game purchase option. That was quite a pity. Intruder. The Hydra lowered one of its giant heads. A man hiding in the shadows said, "Get out of this place. Otherwise that I won't mind having another subject in my laboratory." A non-player character can speak. Ling Pinyin was stunned. Could this be a cut scene? It doesn't look like it. He hurried to contact the game's official support and received an answer. The Legend of Nightmare used the newest artificial intelligence algorithms and achieved the personification of each character in the game. The characters could interact with the players, and the players' choices and behavior could also affect the non-player characters. Wow! Ling Pinyin thought to himself, how can it be so advanced? However, after giving it some more thought, Ling Pinyin realized that the Federal Empire might actually have the capacity to create a game like this. Education and scientific research had been the priorities of every administration of the central federal government. Both education and scientific research were known as the programs that couldn't be cut under any circumstances in the annual budget. Even during an economic recession, the central federal government would rather cut back expenditures on the military and the royal family than take away 1 cent from the education and scientific research programs. Anyone who dared to move that money would be dismissed immediately. Thinking about this, Ling Pinyin was able to dispel all the doubts in his mind. Even a junior boss has the nerve to talk such nonsense. Ling Pinyin sneered. But he remained calm and composed on the outside in order to fit in with the culture and style of the game. He prostrated himself, saying, "Amitba, you're clinging to a false notion of your ego." While speaking, he secretly spent 20,000 point certificates of Nightmare to activate the new skill in the skill bar. The point certificates of Nightmare that he had earned through hard work instantly dropped to single digits. I will offer sacrifices. Thinking of that, Ling Pinyin kept walking forward. With a stately bearing, he looked exceptionally solemn and benevolent. Golden lotuses bloomed underneath his feet as he stepped forward. The flattened and crushed corpses and skeletons on the ground were all covered by sacred Buddhist lotuses. Countless flowers that were made of Buddhist light fell from the sky. Ling Pinyin chanted in a soft voice, "Amitba, you shall attain salvation through repentance." Excellent! Excellent! Following that, a succession of black shadows, contorting in agony, floated out of the corpses and skeletons. They were roaring and struggling in excruciating pain. Eventually, the black smudges on their bodies were washed off little by little. The pain and resentment slowly dissipated. And their contorted bodies gradually returned to normal. All of a sudden, these spirits seemed to understand something. They all looked at Ling Pinyin and prostrated themselves on the ground and chanted, moved by compassion, "Bodhisattvas take the vow to liberate all living beings. Attain salvation through repentance." At first, only the spirits were intoning. However, the stones on the ground began to jump up one after the other during the chanting. The stones started to grow mouths and joined the spirits, "Attain salvation through repentance." They were followed by the grasses and flowers. Their stems, leaves, and buds also opened the mouths and chanted solemnly and sincerely, "Attain salvation through repentance." In the end, even the clouds in the sky seemed to be muttering, "Attain salvation through repentance." Eyes widening, Chu Weiwei stared at the senior monk. Tall and burly, he walked forward like a wisdom king. The golden lotuses bloomed under his feet. "This is," Chu Weiwei was left open-mouthed, "that this is an eminent monk who has reached the level of Arhat at least." Chu Weiwei had heard from her senior relatives that Master Jingguang from Mount Amei used to convene meetings of his followers and disciples to teach them Buddhist doctrine when he was alive 50 years ago. Master Jingguang had a majestic bearing and could make golden lotuses grow in the ground when he was walking. Flowers with a pleasant fragrance fell from the sky when he gave lessons on Buddhist doctrine. It was such an enchanting and delightful experience that even the maladies of his audience could be cured. Unfortunately, even a venerable monk like he was subject to a limited lifespan. Master Jingguang had unexpectedly summoned his disciples and made arrangements for his funeral on his 108th birthday. Then he passed away peacefully. No one else had reached the level of Arhat since Master Jingguang had died. Yet now, she'd just met another living monk at the level of Arhat with her own eyes. It made Chu Weiwei's heart pound hard in her chest. Nevertheless, she soon realized that she was wrong. Because the senior monk before her was far beyond the level of Arhat. She heard him chant, Amitabha, you shall attain salvation through repentance. Excellent! Excellent! Golden lotuses bloomed. Flowers fell from the sky. The twisted spirits of the dead were freed from their corpses and skeletons. Then, their pain and resentment were washed away by the Buddhist light. It also washed off the demonic magic that had been controlling them. Therefore, these spirits all put their palms together and chanted the phrase, attain salvation through repentance. Along with their chanting, all the stones and plants on the ground, as well as the clouds in the sky, all seemed to become intelligent. Attain salvation through repentance. The Buddhist hymn was steady and ceaseless. It came from all directions and reverberated in the air, chanted by a human, by spirits, by flowers, and by trees. As if the entire world had joined in the grand and blessed chorus. Attain salvation through repentance. Chu Weiwei felt as if her body and soul had been purified by this sacred hymn. Her physical fatigue and psychological fear of this strange world of nightmare evaporated bit by bit. Establish the doctrine of the whole world with one phrase. Only a reincarnated Lama can have such ability. Chu Weiwei was astonished. Nonetheless, the man hiding in the shadow of the nine-headed serpent Hydra had a completely different feeling. Attain salvation through repentance. The incessant beat of the hymn felt like maggots digging into his body. Not only was it burned in his mind, but it also haunted his soul. It shook his confidence, weakened his resolve, and even completely changed the thoughts in his mind. It buried him in reminiscences of the past. It immersed him in the memory of his early days when he was still weak and puny. In a trance, he suddenly developed a thought that he was guilty of the most heinous crimes and should beg for the Buddha's mercy immediately. Fortunately, he was able to maintain a firm will. He bit his tongue the moment he became aware of the thoughts in his head. And he woke up at once to the pain. He broke free from the Buddhist hymn. However, even though he'd escaped himself, his mount, the nine-headed serpent bestowed on him by his master, apparently didn't have the same level of willpower and self-control. Crack! Crack! The gigantic monster lowered its 9 heads. Its hulking body dropped and kneeled down. Surprisingly, tears poured out of its eyes on its 9 decaying, maggot-covered heads. It was crying like a human. Bang! 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 The 9-headed serpent banged its heads frantically. 9 giant heads were all rhythmically knocking on the ground. Its loud noise seemed to be saying, "Please, show me some mercy. Please, show me some mercy. Please, redeem my lost soul. Please, redeem my lost soul." The wizard of death hiding behind the 9-headed serpent finally gave in upon seeing the scene. He didn't dare to face the bizarre and powerful monk anymore. He turned around and beat a hasty retreat, running toward the castle on the cliff far away. Chapter 48. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Mirage Translator. Nyo.io Studio Editor. Nyo.io Studio. Ling Pinyin looked at the monster in front of him that was banging its heads like crazy and the person who had headed for the hills. He couldn't help but say to himself, this is quite a potent skill. And I like it. The second icon in his skill bar lit up. Buddhist hymn level 1. Cost 80 mana points, release Buddhist hymn at all enemy subjects within a 30-yard radius. All the enemy targets that are impacted by the Buddhist hymn will be subjected to a mandatory mental exam. If they fail the exam, they will be controlled by the Buddhist hymn and chant the Buddhist hymn for 15 seconds. They can't cast spells or fight while being controlled in this way. If they pass the exam, their mental attributes will be lowered by 1 to 3 points. It is probable that the subject could be put into a state of shock. Note: the effect of the Buddhist hymn will be raised to 200% on ghosts, spirits, specters, and monsters. Instruction: compassion is the principle of life for enlightened monks. The skill didn't seem to be very powerful on paper. But it was actually very effective in reality. Not only did the visuals look good, the skill also came with special effects. Most important, the controlling effect was extremely useful. Its only downside was that enemies could resist the Buddhist hymn if they had enough strength of will. Nevertheless, it was an impressive skill to have. At the very least, it was remarkable when dealing with low-level monsters. Ling Pinyin finally understood the thought processes of the rich people who spent money like water on computer games. Who could resist such a gratifying gaming experience? Thankfully, I was born into an ordinary family. Ling Pinyin thought to himself, otherwise, I probably would have squandered all the family fortune. Be that as it may, he still cared about his public image in the game. He walked to the enormous 9-headed serpent that was kneeling on the ground. He stretched out his hand benevolently and chanted, Amitabha. Excellent! Excellent! The giant 9-headed serpent collapsed with a loud bang. Beams of Buddhist light shone out of its gigantic body. This was the additional absolution effect of the Buddhist hymn. There was also an option for absolution for all the subjects that were controlled by the Buddhist hymn. The gamer could administer absolution after spending certain mana points. Although there was no official description explaining in detail what this absolution was, Ling Pinyin figured that it must be similar to redeeming the souls of the subjects. As he expected, he soon received a message from the Legend of Nightmare. You administered absolution for the enslaved Hydra, and received 2,000 point certificates of Nightmare. You also gained the admiration of the Hydra clan. From now on, there is a certain probability that folktales and a holy picture of you will appear in all the worlds in which the Hydras live. Ling Pinyin was astounded by the message. Is that allowed? If this game starts beta testing? His eyes widened. He understood how attractive such a design was to players with deep pockets. He imagined that some rich people might be willing to spend tens of thousands of dollars once the holy picture option had been officially added. Therefore, a possible reason suddenly popped into Ling Pinyin's head. Maybe I'm a beta tester selected by the company to assess the game before they activate the in-game purchase option. It was the only logical explanation. Since that was the case, Ling Pinyin decided not to turn it down out of courtesy. It was a test. What kind of a test would it be if he didn't torment the game designers and developers? So he turned back and waved at the dumbfounded, open-mouthed onlooker and said, Lucky one, come here and open the treasure boxes. Countless treasure boxes were lying on the ground. The one next to his feet looked like it was made of gold. It was the one that had been left behind by the enslaved Hydra. Chu Weiwei raised her head and looked at the shadows that had been illuminated by the Buddhist light as they slowly rose from the ground and disappeared in the sky. She exhaled a sigh. Phew! It's finally over. Torture and suffering for 200 years. She understood that she was at Acre Castle. The ancient battlefield from 200 years ago. Now, with his great compassion and magical power, the eminent monk had redeemed those pitiful souls that had been confined in the darkness for so long. They had finally gained redemption. Chu Weiwei watched those smiling shadows slowly vanish from her sight. She remembered the heroes of the Federal Empire who had sacrificed themselves for the justice and liberty of humankind during numerous wars. Many of them were nowhere to be found. Perhaps they had also been trapped in this world of nightmare. If they could only be lucky enough to meet that venerable monk. They will definitely meet him. Chu Weiwei said to herself with full confidence. At that moment, she heard the monk calling her, "Lucky one, come here and open the treasure boxes." She answered right away, "I'm coming, master." She totally ignored that the monk had called her the lucky one. Was there anything wrong with a powerful and distinguished monk having a flippant and cynical attitude? Absolutely not. It was a warm and sunny morning in Paris. Tourists had gathered in front of the famous Arc de Triomphe and were taking pictures. Little children were busy running around and playing. All of a sudden, the sound of music reverberated in the air. The entire avenue resounded with impassioned singing. March on! Sons and daughters of the motherland! Arise! An honorable day is waiting for you. Military boots stamped on the cobblestone streets rhythmically. Countless people cast their eyes toward the direction of the music. A contingent of troops wearing elaborate uniforms was marching down the street with great vigor and momentum while holding a ragged military flag high. Look, the despot is facing us. Raise the blood-stained flag. Raise the blood-stained flag. The tourists were stupefied. It's the Garde du Corps. Some people who were familiar with history exclaimed. Throughout the history of France, only one army had fought for the emperor and the homeland with such fortitude and determination. They were the only ones who could march so vigorously. And they were the only ones who wore such extravagant and sophisticated uniforms. Everyone took out their cameras and wanted to take pictures. However, these troops walked directly through the tourists' bodies, the cars, the buildings, and the walls of the stores. It appeared to be an illusion, yet they looked extremely real. The crowd was struck dumb and stared vacantly at the soldiers who were singing the battle song in high spirits. The troops marched toward the south, where the emperor, their comrades in arms, and the past greatness of their country lay buried. Then the people woke up from their stupefaction and began to take pictures with their phones and cameras frantically. Click. Click. Nevertheless, the soldiers were not visible on the negatives or on the phone cameras. Even so, the passionate battle song and the rousing chorus were still lingering in people's ears. Several minutes later, tourists who were visiting Les Invalides watched a group of soldiers singing and parading. They walked through crowds and streets, cars and walls, and eventually marched into the tomb of the emperor. March on! Sons and daughters of the motherland! Arise! An honorable day is waiting for you. The rhythmic sound of footsteps mixed with their sonorous voices. Tears streamed down many people's faces. However, the sound of singing and the footsteps of the soldiers got farther and farther away and eventually faded. They disappeared into Les Invalides and the tomb of the emperor. As though they were demonstrating that epoch had finally come to an end. Everything was over now. As a result of these incidents, the internet in France exploded. But all the posts about these incidents were deleted within 1 hour. The Ministry of Internal Affairs of France immediately issued a statement claiming that this had only been a mirage caused by a fluctuation of the magnetic fields of Earth, and people shouldn't be alarmed. Chapter 49. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A lady translator. Nyo I.bo studio editor. Nyo I.bo studio. Chu Weiwei could work much more efficiently now that she had some experience with sweeping a floor. She finished sweeping in less than 10 minutes. She also sorted and sold a large amount of garbage and recycling. Much to her surprise, by the end she had gained more than 3,000 point certificates of Nightmare through a variety of tips. Because of this, the game awarded her a Nightmare milestone. A silver-grade Nightmare milestone. Coattail Rider. Grade, Silver. Note: without participating in any fight, you've earned more than 3,000 point certificates of Nightmare through tips only. Effect: you will be ranked higher than a commoner in any Nightmare world that has hierarchies or social classes. Introduction. Rise up. Youngsters. Because you have earned your first nightmare milestone, the information on nightmare milestones is now available. You can earn other nightmare milestones in this nightmare world. Femme fatale. You successfully made 2 servants of Alucard duel to the death for you and in front of you. Racketeer. You successfully sold 10 products to indigenous people and received full payment. Criminal. You killed 10 indigenous people. You can't review any further information on nightmare milestones as your access is limited. Chu Weiwei blushed at the content of these marks of nightmare. Because she had acted like a freeloader who'd undeservedly benefited from the success of other people. She'd stood by and watched all the fights. She hadn't had the ability to play a role in any of those clashes. Even the weakest monster and spirit among them could have easily crushed her. She had made absolutely 0 contributions in defeating these enemies. Nevertheless, not only had she received a great number of point certificates of nightmare, she'd also gained several pieces of equipment. This all made Chu Weiwei feel a little downhearted. Let's go. The elder monk, on the other hand, didn't mind at all. On the contrary, he waved at her and said, "There are more monsters out there waiting to be redeemed by me." Chu Weiwei was filled with admiration for the elder monk's magnanimity and kindness. She hurried to follow behind him. They strode forward and soon arrived at a castle that was on a cliff by the sea. The castle looked grim and ghastly. Crack, crack, sparks of dark blue fire broke out and started to burn the castle. Soon, the fire flared up and spread rapidly and furiously. Chu Weiwei's eyes got wide. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. This thing in front of her was not a castle at all. It was a huge pile of giant white bones stacked up high. The fire was blazing on these malformed bones, while countless creatures were crawling on the bones. Some of them looked like dragonflies with broad wings. Yet their bodies were more similar to maggots, soft, white, and chubby. Their heads bore some resemblance to human babies. But they looked much creepier. One after the other, these creatures the size of small puppies opened their mouths, showing their long, sharp teeth. Creak. Creak. These scary creatures ground their teeth, making a harsh scraping sound. Intruders. Now, the earth was trembling beneath their feet. A giant clumsy monster crawled out from the darkness. Its massive body squashed countless bones as it moved. Chu Weiwei became so afraid that she couldn't breathe when she saw the monster. The monster raised its head and roared, "Leave my castle." Its enormous head was on full display. Chu Weiwei had never seen such an ugly, deformed head. It looked a bit like a middle-aged obese woman. Only it was 100 times bigger. The fat on the face was squeezed together so much that it distorted all its features, which made it look even more bizarre. After careful observation, however, it was apparent that the monster was definitely not human. Because its body was supported by innumerable legs and tentacles. Like a centipede, the monster had legs under its giant body that were dozens of feet long. It also had numerous tentacles that were as thick as water pipes, which stretched out from both sides of its body. The huge suckers on the tentacles began to wave frantically. At this point, Chu Weiwei received a notification from the Marks of Nightmare. Warning! Warning! You have entered the territory of Moradon the Princess Pestilence. Be Noel Dem, you have been affected by the pestilent ring of Moradon the Princess Pestilence. Your vigor, endurance, and strength have been weakened. Warning! Warning! You are within the area where you can be affected by the pestilent ring. You are now likely to be infected by a variety of diseases. From this time forward, you will be subjected to a mandatory exam every 30 seconds. If you don't pass the exam, you will randomly contract a severe infectious disease. If you pass the exam, you will randomly contract a mild infectious disease. Chu Weiwei's mind was completely overwhelmed by these messages. To make matters even worse, a man wearing a black robe and a mask also emerged from the darkness. He held a staff that was forged from human bones. "Intruders, how dare you step into the territory of the beautiful Princess Moradon and disturb Her Highness's sleep? You are signing your own death warrants." As he was speaking, the corpses on the ground stood up and stumbled forward one by one. However, an unexpected change occurred the next moment. Princess Moradon seemed to have found the most precious treasure in the world. Her big, ferocious head suddenly lowered. She had found a giant mirror that was made from human bones somewhere. Looking into the mirror, she started to put makeup on her face. However, she was not an accomplished makeup artist, and the cosmetic products that she was using were incredibly terrifying. She applied a layer of some mysterious slime mixed with blood to her face. It made her already deformed face look even more twisted. But she seemed quite satisfied when she looked at her face in the mirror. After that, she picked up a big comb also made of bone and carefully smoothed out her messy, dirty hair. Finally, she raised her head once again. "This gentleman." Princess Moradon craned her head like a snake and licked her piggy lips with a tongue that was as large as a cow. Before the stunned masked man and Chu Weiwei, she extended an invitation. "I wonder if I could have the honor of having dinner with you." As she was speaking, her blood was heating up and rushing around her massive body, giving her a particularly ruddy complexion. All the legs under her body were twitching with excitement. The tentacles were also jerking uncontrollably. "Your Highness." The masked man shouted back at her, "You should honor the agreement you made with my master. You're talking too loudly." Princess Moradon didn't deign to answer what he had said. Her tentacles immediately reached out and wrapped around the masked man. Then she pulled him up to her face. "Do you know how rude it is to attempt to interrupt a lady's date?" Her tentacles tore the masked man into pieces. The man couldn't defend himself at all. "This gentleman. Please don't misunderstand me." Seeing how frightened Chu Weiwei was, Princess Moradon suddenly became shy. She said with a coy smile, "I'm actually very gentle and sweet. My father Duke Ivy once praised me. He said that no other lady in the entire world of hell is more tender-hearted than I am." Chapter 50. You are listening at novelfull.audio. I don't deserve to have his children. Translator. Nyo I.bo Studio Editor. Nyo I.bo Studio. Ling Pinyin stared at the giant woman in front of him. He scratched his head. "Even though I always have trouble recognizing faces. And can't tell if a person is beautiful or ugly." It was true. Ling Pinyin had been this way since he was a child. All women looked similar to him, regardless of their appearances. Of course, he knew the social standards of attractiveness. V-shaped face, almond-shaped eyes, cherry lips, fair complexion, and curvy figure. Nonetheless, all women looked exactly the same to him. He was never impressed by the so-called beautiful girls. And he couldn't see anything wrong with the women other people considered ugly. Because of this, Ling Pinyin had secretly sought help from doctors. They'd told him that he had a rare disorder that only affected a tiny percentage of the population. It was called prosopagnosia. Allegedly, there was only one person besides him who had been diagnosed with this disorder in the entire Federal Empire, which had a population of over 2 billion people. And there was no cure for this disease. Fortunately, it wouldn't affect his health or disrupt his daily life. It had only led to some difficulties when it came to his social interactions. Nonetheless, Ling Pinyin watched the giant head that was bigger than several adult elephants stacked together approaching his face. He was hurt and offended. Ling Pinyin took another look at the monster's body and felt deeply insulted. On top of that, he was being insulted by a NPC in a game. Even though I've always been a man with a mild temper. That's in real life. I always throw heavy blows in computer games. Why don't you ask around in Summoner's Rift? Anyone who saw my ID would tremble in fear in the Bronze Division. 1. Ling Pingyan decided at once that he would make this person understand what it meant to infuriate an expert player. He wanted to show her what a legendary gamer looked like. He immediately sold all the silver-grade equipment and materials that he had been planning on trading in the pawn shop after he finished playing in this instance zone. It made his point certificates of Nightmare skyrocket to more than 60,000. A frightening level. Subsequently, he spent those point certificates of Nightmare right away to activate the other 2 skills in his skill bar. The point certificates of Nightmare plunged to less than 100. Then he raised his head and stared at the mighty monster in front of him. What a pathetic little ploy. How dare you show off your skills before me? He leaped up and bellowed, Almighty Dragon of Heaven. Venerable Ksitigarbha of Hell. A Buddhist lotus grew out of his body. Eyes wide, Chu Weiwei looked at the burly monk who was jumping high up in the air. What a pathetic little ploy. How dare you show off your skills before me? Almighty Dragon of Heaven. Venerable Ksitigarbha of Hell. Along with a thunderous roar, Chu Weiwei received a message from the Mark of Nightmare. Your teammate Monk Fahai activated the aura of the Venerable Ksitigarbha of Hell. You will also be affected by the aura of the Venerable Ksitigarbha of Hell. All the negative status effects you have are cancelled. You've entered the area affected by the aura of the Venerable Ksitigarbha of Hell. All of your attributes have increased by 20% temporarily. You have gained the Buddha's blessed status. All of your attacks will be considered sacred damage. Sacred damage. Your damage to monsters, ghosts, and devils increases by 100%, with a certain chance to nullify the target's defenses. You gain the Buddha's protection status. Buddha's protection. No strike can kill you immediately. You will enter a near-death stage. You will be invincible to damage that occurred after you entered the near-death stage. The invulnerability period will last for 3 seconds. You can't move, cast spells, or use any item during this time. Reading the messages scrolling in front of her eyes, Chu Weiwei was stunned. Previously, she had been worried and scared of the pestilent aura of Moradon, the Princess Pestilence. She had thought that the entire world would come to an end if such a monster appeared in real life. But Chu Weiwei knew better now. The monster would certainly be killed even if it came into existence in reality. Masters such as the Elder Monk and the Commander-in-Chief were more than capable of subduing or even slaughtering this monster. Chu Weiwei finally felt relieved after she had realized that. Puzzled and confounded, Princess Moradon stared at the man who had jumped in the air and pounced on her. In her eyes, the monk looked like a human. But, under his human shell, his body was built with tissues that were strong enough to make people lose their minds. A source of ancient power and some unknown taboos were operating throughout his body. These taboos were even older and more formidable than her father, Duke Ivy, was. His sheer craziness and overwhelming strength had mixed together and created an ultimate temptation that no devil could resist. In Princess Moradon's eyes, the monk was the perfect mating candidate. She believed that she would definitely conceive a child of evil with tremendous strength and infinite wisdom if she could mate with him. All of a sudden, Princess Moradon thought of something. She straightened her massive body. That's right. I have to prove to him that I deserve his distinguished pedigree and ancient power. She believed that she had spent too much time here with the commoners. And she forgot the tradition of hell. A woman who wanted to have children with someone. She had to prove herself first. Only a powerful individual was worthy of mating with someone at his level. The weak ones only deserved to be prey. It was pretty common for devils to consume their own kind, even their siblings. Moradon herself had eaten her 3 sisters. Therefore, the giant monster sprang up, facing the monk who was lunging at her. I will certainly prove myself. Determined and motivated, her huge body became quite flexible and agile all of a sudden. The giant monster's tentacles transformed into sharp weapons. She struck hard at the monk. Then, bang! 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 Ling Pingyan rained blows down on the weapons coming at him. He dashed against the blades. Supreme wisdom of all Buddhas. He'd activated his ultimate skill. A golden lotus bloomed with each punch. Bang! 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 The sound of explosions echoed in the sky like firecrackers. The deafening noise was almost like rolls of thunder. That even the sky had turned dark green. Chu Weiwei raised her head and watched the dark green blood, flesh, and organs raining down from above. The mark of nightmare sent her a message. You have witnessed the death of Moradon, the Princess Pestilence. The history of the nightmare world of Pestilence had been changed. Because of the death of Moradon, the Princess Pestilence. The embryos of Pestilence couldn't continue to grow. The embryos of Pestilence were already dead. The curse on the Beizhou kingdom was lifted. The connection between Alucard, the Blood River Overlord, and this nightmare world was cut off due to the demise of Moradon, the Princess Pestilence. Alucard would no longer be able to enter this nightmare world. The nightmare mission is finished. The main nightmare mission, Find Alucard, has been accomplished. Settling the current nightmare world mission. At this moment, a huge head fell from the sky and landed slightly in front of Chu Weiwei. The ferocious Princess Pestilence seemed to be alive still. She opened her mouth and threw up a big pool of dark green blood. She was muttering something under her breath. Chu Weiwei only understood her after listening carefully. I don't deserve. Indeed. I don't deserve. To have his children. With a loud noise, the giant head blew up into tiny pieces. A rose-gold treasure box popped up in the same place. The burly monk also landed on the ground. He waved at Chu Weiwei and said, "Lucky one, come here and open the treasure box." 1. Summoner's Rift and Bronze Division are terms in the League of Legends, another computer game.